For those who want to hear of success and of the good things, get up and get yourself some snacks, maybe a drink. Actually, Saints fans should get a drink too. Something strong. You'll need it. The intermission years get tough. This is where things turn really, really bad. It all started with this. In 1976, as the league began to adopt a professional image, each club was required to adopt an official logo, each with the same font and basic shield design. Most looked okay, some actually look really good in a retro way today. Melbourne's was a bit goofy, but whatever. St Kilda's, well, it's a stick figure. This thing, known to the fans as Stickman, hung around like a wart for 13 years, and there was even evidence of him being used before this. They had a real chance in 1989 to make it better, and oh no. Oh, it's worse. Look, there's your real logo, the thing you've literally been wearing since the actress from Bewitched was born. Use that! But no. It would take another 6 years for that bright idea to spark up. Stickman was the logo that the Saints deserved in the intermission years. Nothing to it. No complex ideology, no merit to its structure nor its design, standing around awkwardly for something to happen, looking like a beggar at a bus stop. Ross Smith, their Brownlow hero of 1967, became one of many Saints coaches to coach only one season. He wins 3 games and a wooden spoon, and then he departs. And then Mike Patterson came along. He'd won 3 senior premierships and a champion of Australia, most of that as a captain coach of North Adelaide. One hell of a resume. St Kilda hired him to plug holes in their sinking ship, and it wasn't going well. He had a win rate of 30%, which was awful by normal standards, but only slightly below par for St Kilda. After winning a varnished spoon of his own in 1979, it looked like on-field results were going to doom him. They did, but in a strange way. Lindsay Fox, transport magnate, took over as club president that year. He wanted to bring in premiership quality players and he'd land the biggest recruit in St Kilda history to that point. Carlton fired their own president at the end of 1979 despite winning the premiership. Their captain and coach, who'd had pay disputes behind the scenes, quit out of solidarity, having forged an alliance and friendship with the man at the top. Their legacies were as a direct result of Allan Jeans' Saints failing to get the job done 9 years prior, but the Saints signed them both for 1980. And best of all, they were both the same man. As a coach, he was a proven winner, but as a player, he was a beauty. Alex Jesaulenko was hired as a player only, but Fox knew he still had interest in coaching. Patterson wasn't getting results, and so Fox's finger was pulsing on the button. And in round 2, he pushed him. 2 Saints accidentally bumped into each other during the match. Now, as an Adelaide fan, I see this at least 3 times a week from our young and often shambolic defence. It happens. It's not fun and I hate it, but it happens. But Fox saw this as a lack of discipline, something he couldn't tolerate, and terminated Patterson's employment on the spot. From here, history goes one of 2 ways. Either the Saints drop, stay roughly where they were because there's no going down from here, or they rise up and start winning, justifying the decision and painting Fox as a club legend. Of course, this being St Kilda, you know what happens. Jezza gets 13 wins over 3 seasons, his win rate half as bad again as the man he replaced. He retires as the last captain coach the VFL would ever see. This time period also saw President Huggins step down. The man who'd appointed Allan Jeans and had also been instrumental, along with Alan Drake, in bringing the Saints to Moorabbin, had stepped away. He had become the VFL's vice president and had a chance at the outright presidency, but rejected it to stay loyal to St Kilda. Fortius quo fidelius indeed. Going back to the Patterson era briefly, the Saints had just had their worst ever loss to Footscray. Some of the players ran off before the game had ended. It was that bad. The next week, they had the reigning Premier Kangaroos to play. But when the final siren sounded, the score looked like this. Honourable loss. Well done, right? Nope. Because this man had the ball. Robert Elliott was, well, average. Boilerplate. Standard. Across his 60 games in a Moorabbin tenure which would end mere weeks later, he'd scored 12 goals and hadn't polled in the Brownlow. But today, he'd come to play. 26 touches, about to have a 27th, his second best tally of his career, and a goal. That goal had come some 3 minutes before, with St Kilda having blown a 6-goal, 3/4 time advantage, because of course they had, for the Kangaroos to take a late lead. Elliott's effort put the Saints up, only for Stephen Easton to goal with practically no time left. Somehow, the Saints take it straight from the ruck contest and put it into Robert Elliott's arms. Now, he's 50 metres out, with a strong headwind. All he can do is give it his best. Now, this kick didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Really, it didn't. North would have won the McClellan Trophy either way, and St Kilda would have missed the finals either way, so what happens next doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter if Steve McCann batted it through, which apparently it looked very much like he did. It didn't matter if Eric Brewer signalled a goal or a point. But signal a goal he did. This was St Kilda's best and most famous win of the intermission years, and much like their ancestors' one hit at glory, it really shouldn't have counted. Add that to the list. Remember all of these. Retribution will be had. But again, we'll get to that. The headline names of previous times had bold stories, brave acts, and moments that decided history. The headline name of the intermission years, though, has perhaps the boldest story of all. I'd always assumed Robbie Mad Dog Muir was just another 70s loose cannon, so I prepared a funny little piece to lighten the mood a bit. But as I read about his life and career, I saw a story that foreshadowed the tough times that St Kilda were about to experience. Muir had a tough upbringing. He was subject to racial abuse during his junior playing days because 1970s Australia was hell for anyone who wasn't the colour of cartridge paper. A Ballarat umpire reported him for kicking and got him banned for 30 months, an outrageous penalty sparked by racial bias and grudges. His daughter was taken from him around this time as well, causing him to fall into alcoholism to cope. He was a brilliant player though. On the strength of 7 games in his Ballarat return, he was picked up by St Kilda. His form under Allan Jeans was astounding. Neil Roberts and Ron Barassi attested to his talent. There was just one problem. Racism in Australian sport is nothing new. St Kilda's most famous racial incident was still over a decade after Muir's retirement, and we're still dealing with it now. In the 70s and 80s though, it was normalised, unsanitised, raw. Some players dealt with it by playing the game so well it rendered all abuse completely redundant. But Muir didn't. Now, I'm completely ill-equipped to say how people should handle racial abuse. I'll leave that to Robbie Muir himself. He soon built up a reputation. His nickname, given to him because of his drive and passion around the field, itself became a somewhat racist generalised symbol of his anger issues, themselves driven by racial abuse and childhood trauma. When Muir was again reported for kicking, this time in a Saints reserve game, with his victim again appealing for leniency, the VFL player advocate relied on racial stereotypes for his defence. Of course, this was disgusting, and Muir transferred to West Torrens for a year. He came back, kept copping abuse, and kept snapping, culminating in the 12-game suspension that ended his career, much to the chagrin of Maurice Rioli. A person like this needs support from their club, and who better than the Saints to provide it? Fortius quo fidelius and all that. But the Saints gave him very little. One player said he could do nothing to prevent the abuse. Bullshit. He was reportedly pissed on by teammates, abused by his own fans, and sought refuge alone. Strength through loyalty, at least for now, had its limitations. St Kilda failed, and continues to fail, a brilliant player and otherwise great man. Yeah, fortius quo fidelius indeed. If anything summed up the attitudes of the intermission years, it was this. It took until late 2022, early in the production of this series, for the Saints to formally acknowledge him and properly welcome him back into their folds. Nowadays, the Saints are known for their bevy of Indigenous talent and creating pathways for young Indigenous players to enter their club. They've come a long way. Unfortunately, it's taken them 40 whole years to do it. During the losing years under Jesaulenko, there was at least one moment that went down in folklore in a lighter fashion. Jeff Fehring was a big man. Really big. He was a ruckman who had struggled at Geelong as they tried to find a replacement for Sammy Newman and Polly Farmer, hard acts to follow. He came to St Kilda, broke into the side in 1980 and kept his spot at the start of 81. He did well against his old club before matching up against Collingwood. Peter Moore towelled him and Fehring lost it a bit. He got reported, but won the ball back in the midfield soon after. Incensed by being reported and assisted by the wind, he went bang. This is what St Kilda were all about. Even from the start, winning wasn't a part of who they were. It was just about having a go. What was the worst that could happen? After all, 80% of St Kilda's existence had been the worst that could happen. The destination didn't matter. The journey mattered. The Saints let the footy gods take the wheel while they took in the scenery. A lot of the time they crashed off the road. But sometimes, in ever so brief but oh so glorious flashes, they went the distance. Jeff Fehring's kick travelled 9 metres longer than any other recorded goal. Unlike Dustin Fletcher, he wasn't a 400-game superstar. Unlike Malcolm Blight, he wasn't a goal-kicking machine. Unlike Big Dave McNamara, he wouldn't go down as a Saints Hall of Famer. And unlike Ryan Griffin, he saw very little of the ball. Griffin touched the ball twice as often in his 2007 season than Fehring did in his 36-game, 4-goal career. And this was the last of those 4 being delisted at year's end and moving to Norwood. Not long after winning an SANFL flag, he tried his hand at farming and pub ownership, but both failed catastrophically. He lost everything. His home, his livelihood, his health, and eventually his own life at his own hand in 2008. But just for a moment, back in 1981, he had the hearts of 25,000 people. And he still has their hearts to this day. Fehring lifted his Premiership Cup right as Jesaulenko got his marching orders. Fox then turned to another Premiership winner, Tony Jewell. He'd lifted 2 cups for Richmond, one as a player and one as coach, so surely he'd see some success. Well, I mean, you been listening at all? And yes, I could go off at Fox for hiring and firing coaches every 30 minutes, but Fox was a Saint through and through. He was born in Prahran, for God's sake. He played 20 games for the Saints and was even part of that 1963 Moorabbin Premiership side. Becoming the chairman of the St Kilda Football Club was a dream come true for this man, and his Lynn Fox capital saved the club. St Kilda were in big trouble in 1980. The Saints' various creditors were owed $1.5 million, about $6.8 million in 2021 money, and that's still worth about half the salary cap in today's mega money game. Imagine how much it would have been back then. This wasn't helped by a $5,000 fine they copped in 1981 for pinching Doug Cox from Richmond's recruiting zone, and they were lucky to get the 8 premiership points they were stripped of back. They ended up really needing them. Trevor Barker, upon winning his second best and fairest, tried to wipe a chunk off all by himself. He reportedly won a car for his performances in 1981, and without a second thought he raffled it off to raise crucial funds for the club he loved. He was a brilliant player, and he'd had opportunities to go elsewhere and really add to his career with premierships and glory, but he never entertained them for a moment. There was no way the Saints could pay the rest of the debt off outright though, so Fox devised a plan. The main people you'd want to pay off first are those doing battle for you. So Fox offered the players 22.5 cents for each dollar they were owed, with a promise of full reparations some way down the line, which the players took to save their club. Barker and Barry Breen were critical in convincing the players. A similar offer was made to non-football creditors, but their receipts were slashed to 7.5 cents per dollar. Amazingly, there were only two non-takers, a small furniture store and Carlton, weirdly. Again, Trevor Barker was part of the negotiating process, especially when he was made captain in 1983. So the Saints managed to only pay off a shade under 200 grand to have a debt 7.5 times that amount forgiven. Amazing. Unless, of course, Fox failed to fulfill his promises to the players. Oh dear. There were many players who performed admirably on that day in 1966. But in the end, Barry Breen is ultimately, with his crucial yet wayward kick, the man responsible for this. The one and only Premiership Cup St Kilda had in their possession by the early 1980s. This is the one bloke who you want to pay back in full. This is the only bloke you don't want to piss off. Of course, this being St Kilda. It was Breen that Fox asked to give the hard sell to the players, to ask his mates, the guys who looked up to him, to just surrender 80% of their money in the hopes that it would come back someday. It was Breen who raised $30,000 in his testimonial retirement season, 15% of the club's payments to debtors. And it was Breen who, even ignoring that 30 grand, was already the club's biggest football creditor. He was owed $65,000 or 300 grand in today's money. He got about 10% of that back. And by the sound of Bruce DePeruzzel's testimony, none of them got their money back. That includes Alex Jesaulenko. That includes Trevor Barker. That includes Jeff Sorrell. That includes Jeff Fehring. And that includes Allan goddamn Jeans. Breen would later be instrumental in further fundraising efforts for the Saints. And just as he did in the 1980s, Lindsay Fox didn't open his wallet any more than he needed to. Now, yes, he saved the club by culling its debts, and that is admirable. It saved the club. I cannot stress that enough. It was a genuinely awesome thing to do. Great work. He even wore a few punches for the cause, literally. Remember that legendary choke Moorabbin pulled in the 62 grand final, the precursor for St Kilda's own experiences? Fox was attacked by fans, angry at the 45-point turnaround. He'd built his empire whilst still playing for the Saints. He loved that team, and he still does. But even at that point, the man was a millionaire. Now, as of 2023, he's on the ABR 100 and he's regularly in the top 10. He's worth hundreds of millions. It's not about helping the Saints out now. He's done enough for the entity that is the club. But for all these guys that gave their all during the worst times a footy club can have, I think he should settle some of the debt as a gesture of goodwill. At the very least, he should formally acknowledge these guys for giving up a lot of money, especially the hero of his club's only glory. But even technically saving his club didn't stop Fox from becoming the butt of a butt joke. A cigarette butt, that is, still lit, shoved into his pocket by Mark Jackson. Yeah, that one. Wacko Jacko also put a brick under Trevor Barker's brake pedal, but seeing as the Saints never went anywhere in the 80s, no one was hurt. Jackson, though, was sacked halfway through 1983. Of course, this being St Kilda, he remained their leading goal kicker for that year. They brought in a player from South Melbourne as the Swans relocated, Paul Morwood, and they played him without the Swans' permission. They would forfeit the 4 points for a win if they got the result, and they almost did. Another Saint who joined because they didn't want to go along to Sydney was Silvio Voschini. And to talk about him, I've got to introduce you to zoning and how it caused this mess for the Saints. The inter- and post-war VFL had been dominated by 3 clubs, and they became the only clubs that country players wanted to go to. If you were a city slicker, tough luck. The metro areas were zoned to each club, and you had to get permission to go elsewhere, and Big Dave McNamara could attest to how tough that was. As the cities became more of a draw, and as it became clear that the VFL was becoming the dominant Victorian league, the Big Three splashed money at the country clubs to buy all the best talent. The VFL's solution was a state draft. Yeah, in 1957, a state draft. But of course this was pitched between the Korean and Vietnam Wars, where Aussies didn't exactly know what communism was, but they knew they didn't want it. And this draft idea sounded pretty bloody commie to most. The VFL compromised and split Victoria's country regions up into zones by a league, allocating them out like their metro zones. The original idea was for the bottom 4 to get a choice, and the rest went into a lottery each year. No? Too communist? Fine. You get a random zone and that's your lot, because Hawthorn and Carlton found shiny toys they didn't want to share. Apparently that's democracy. Fucking lead paint licking idiots. God, I'm so glad it's not the 60s anymore. Hawthorn's shiny toy is of particular interest to us. St Kilda's move to Moorabbin and Ian Drake's repeated applications to the VFL office put them in a good position to land the prized Mornington Peninsula zone. And indeed, if this idea had been pushed through in 1957 instead of being blocked, St Kilda would have likely got it. Instead, the can was kicked down the road for a decade. And guess who the power team was after 1966? Yep. Despite being closer to the Mornington area, and despite having applied specifically for that area, St Kilda's accidental and only success saw them robbed of the biggest bag of riches a club could ever ask for, instead ending up with Ballarat. If you're from Ballarat, I'm sorry, but what a shithole. It was a black hole of footballing talent, and still is. In the AFL era, it's produced 10 100 gamers. Mornington, meanwhile? Oh, they just produced Dermot Brereton, Gerard Healy, and Lee Goddamn Matthews. And John Coleman, too, actually. The Big Three gave way to the new two, with the Hawks' new recruits capping St Kilda in the ultimate twist of irony on their jaunt to building an empire. That caused this, and that's where our man comes into play. Voschini was drafted in South Melbourne's area as they moved to Sydney. He hated it there, can't see why, and wanted to go home, with St Kilda opening its arms and wallets, but they were denied clearance. In a big court case, Voschini argued that the zones were a breach of free labour laws, winning the case. This, along with the Doug Cox and Paul Morwood fiascos, which both involved St Kilda, led to the downfall of zoned recruitment and the introduction of the national draft. The Saints had finally managed to bring down the institution that crippled them, which would have been an awesome moment if, it hadn't crippled them. See, despite their improved financial position, they had a deficit of country talent, and so they continued to spiral. The 1980s would be almost non-stop torture. You may be wondering why the Allan Jeans era has continued 7 years after his resignation from the Saints. Well, firstly, the downfall after a monarch's departure is also a key part of their reign. And secondly, he found another club. After a 4-year break, he climbed aboard the stuttering Hawthorn Hawks. And much as former Saint Kazali changed their identity, so too did Jeans. The Hawks had success under John Kennedy Sr., but much like the Saints under Jeans, it looked as though it was a coach-led thing, not a club-led thing. Jeans fell a win short of finals in his first year, and he didn't miss them again throughout the rest of his 10-year tenure. And in 1983, he did this. He would win 3 more premierships and mastermind another while absent with a brain injury. And, exactly unlike Alan Killigrew, his very best record came against the team he had made. Oh, his first assistant coach at the Hawks, by the way? Bob Ketty. Yeah, that one. I love footy.
It's the 1st of September, 1984. This is one of 2 games that St Kilda will play in September in the 1980s, both of which are calendar quirks. No finals being played here, guys. It's the final game that Fitzroy will play at Junction Oval, and fittingly, the Saints are the team that does battle in the final VFL fixture that this ground will ever see. The Lions, well, they're being kicked out, and this will be the last game they play on a ground that's solely theirs. They will ground share with Collingwood, Carlton, and even the Western Bulldogs before receiving 2 in the head and 1 in the heart in 1996. They've spent the last 18 years at grounds whose legacies belong to others. They're a long way from Brunswick Street. And of course, this being St Kilda, they used all their history at this ground to get torched by an also-ran who was a decade away from being wiped out of the history books entirely. It was an embarrassment. Forget what I said earlier. This is as bad as it gets.
This is normally the point where we'd quickly skip over the time it took for the Saints to find their new hero. But here comes the third act twist, the sequel hook. They'd already found him. In its final throes, their shitty Ballarat zone that hadn't produced an elite player since Gerard fucking Brosnan gave them nothing short of a footballing god. The Saints already had a new hero, ripe for the crowning. He was playing that day. He'd even had his breakout game. 3 of them, actually. But I'll zoom in on one in particular. Round 5, 1984. Tony Jewell is gone. Former Saints best and fairest and Ballarat zone player Graham Gelly takes his first game in charge. He wants to see a big win against Geelong. Of course, they're coached by Tommy Hafey, with Mark Jackson, Diesel Williams and a young Gary Ablett Sr., so the game's over at half time. It really is an abysmal Saints side, this one. Thanks, Ballarat. But one man turns up and puts on a show. Of the 10 goals the Saints managed, this man scored 7. He earned 3 Brownlow votes in a match where his side was downed by 11 goals. He'd done it before in round 1. Some thought it a fluke. Now, he'd done it twice. He was officially a star. Before long, he'd become an icon, and after that, a legend. His greatness was so easy to explain, the fans sang about it. After all, there's only one Tony Lockett.